Hello everybody and welcome back to the Import-Export Hub channel. My name is Bogdan, and for those of you watching my videos for the first time on this channel, I am covering import-export related topics, and in this episode, as the title suggested, I will cover a little bit the top performing sectors driving Poland's imports and exports for 2020. But before we deep dive into the subject here, I want you to keep in mind that pushing the like and the subscribe buttons will really help this channel grow even more and possibly reach other export enthusiasts out there on YouTube. And without further ado, let's start with the exports of Poland. And we see here that I've added the last 5 years in order to have a little bit of dynamics, if you want. And we see that for the last 5 years, 2018 was the strongest one in terms of total exports, with more than $267 billion worth of exports. As for 2020, the reference year for this video, if you want, the exports totaled to more than $254 billion, which is more or less $8 billion more than what happened in 2019. Which is really great, if you ask me, considering the pandemic and all the related problems. Again, from my point of view, to see countries whose exports grew in a year like 2020, this is really impressive, and this means that Poland is really trying to grow its footprint in the international market, focusing even more on becoming a competitive hub for production, distribution, and exports. Now, in terms of export drivers for 2020, we see that the top chapters or industries, if you want, are all high ranked in the combined nomenclature list, meaning that there could be a lot of value-added activity in Poland. So basically, we have chapters 84 and 85 driving most of Poland's exports. In fact, the cumulative share is about 27%, and very interesting fact here, we see that both chapters experienced increases in 2020 compared with what happened in 2019. And in fact, these two particular sectors grew steadily from 2016 onwards, clearly showing that these sectors are highly competitive, and most probably they also attract a lot of foreign direct investments into Poland. And I won't go on further and cover the top 10 export drivers, but rather tell you that these top 10 sectors cumulatively make up for roughly 60% of Poland's total exports, so not a big export concentration in terms of industries covered, which is again a good thing, meaning that Poland's competitiveness is high in terms of diversity in the manufacturing activity. Now, in terms of annual performance, we see that almost all the top 10 sectors had some increases, except Chapter 87, which is dominantly covered by passenger vehicles and parts, and it's understandable to see this shrinkage. Another sector that experienced a decrease was Chapter 27, with almost 33% contraction, and we have the last one, again just covering the top 10 ones, which is Chapter 72, so basically iron and steel, who had a contraction of about 6%. And before I move on to Poland imports, I want to cover also the export concentration in terms of countries of exports. And we see that Poland's exports are primarily towards European Union member countries, which is again perfectly understandable, as in the case with all the European Union member countries who do a lot of exchange between themselves. Now, in terms of extra European Union exports, we see only the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, again, only considering the top 10 export partners. Now, moving on to the imports of Poland for 2020, we see that for this year, they've totaled to more than $254 billion, which gives Poland a positive balance of trade for 2020 of roughly $491 million. As for the sectors driving Poland's imports, again, we see chapters 84, 85, or 87. So we see a lot of intra-chapter exchange of goods, meaning that Poland has a developed and competitive economy. In terms of cumulative share of these top 10 sectors, we have more or less 56%, which is not very concentrated, while in terms of variability, 2020 was not a great year in terms of imports, as we can see a lot of red here, except chapter 85, who had more than 15% increase in its imports. We see again chapter 39 and chapter 48 to cover only the top 10 performing import sectors, while in terms of partners, again covering only the top 10 ones, we have a lot of countries from the European Union, with Germany on top of the list, but also countries outside the European Union like the Russian Federation, China, the United States, or South Korea. And with this being said, I will move on and cover the top 5 import and export chapters in order to see who are the main partners. And I will begin with chapter 84 for the export flow. And we see here that the total exports accounted for roughly $34 billion, with Germany, the United States, and France being the top 3 trading partners. In terms of year-on-year changes, overall the exports shrunk with almost 2%, driven mainly to the fall in the demand from countries like France, the United Kingdom, the Czech Republic, Italy, and Sweden. There were also some year-on-year increases, as in the case with Germany, the United States, the Netherlands, the Russian Federation, and Spain, again just covering the top 10 export partners for Poland. While in terms of the main drivers for Poland exports, I've added here 2 examples, and we have turbojets and turbopropellers, as in the case with the United States, and spark ignition internal combustion engine, as in the case with Spain. And I think we are ready to go and see the second biggest chapter driving Poland's exports, which is chapter 85, and we see here that the total exports were up 15% compared with 2019, as the demand increased for almost all the top 10 trading partners, considering again just these top 10 ones. Germany again was the biggest export destination, followed by France, and on the 3rd place we have the United Kingdom, which I doubt it will maintain its position from 2021 onwards, given the fact that the UK is no longer a member of the European Union since the 1st of January 2021. And I will stop here with the reading of the trading partners, and I will highlight the year-on-year changes, both positive and negative. Fortunately for Poland, there are only 2 countries with whom the exports fell year on year, and these are the Czech Republic and Hungary, whose exports fell with 5.2 and 7.5% respectively. And on the other hand, as I've said it, fortunately for Poland, there are quite big increases, both in absolute and relative terms, especially with Germany, France, and Sweden, but also with Italy, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Spain. As for the export drivers, we have subheading 8507, so electric accumulators, as in the case with Sweden, and subheading 8528, which is monitors and projectors, as in the case with Hungary. Anyways, moving on to the 3rd most exported chapter, which is chapter 87. We see that the situation was not as good as the previous chapter. We see lots of red, meaning that the demand and consequently the exports shrunk quite a lot. In fact, the year-on-year exports we see here were down almost 17% in relative terms, with large decreases for all top 10 export destinations, except Sweden, who had almost 2% increase. In terms of the main drivers, again, I've added here two examples, and we have spare parts and accessories for tractors and motor vehicles for the transport of 10 or more persons, as in the case with Italy, and the same goes for the Russian Federation too. So this fall really highlights the consumer shifting, if you want, in the demand who rippled through the entire supply chain. And we see that the focus of both the private and the industrial demand or customers was driven primarily by other products or services and not by investments in assets like vehicles. Anyways, moving on to the fourth export driver, we have chapter 94, so furniture, bedding, mattresses, and so on. And we see that the year-on-year exports were down 2% to roughly $14.4 billion in 2020, with Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Slovakia having their demand increased, while countries like the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Hungary, and Denmark having their demand decrease quite significantly. As for the main drivers, again, I've highlighted here two examples for Germany and Slovakia, and for both the exports from this chapter were mainly driven by subchapter 9401, which is basically seats, whether or not convertible into beds. And I think we are ready to go and see the fifth and the last chapter, driving Poland's exports, so chapter 39. And we see here that year on year the exports were up 1.5%, which is not much in relative terms, but it's more or less almost $200 million, which is not at all negligible. Now, in terms of major export destinations, we see again Germany, which has quite a lot of market share. On the second place, we have France, and on the third one, we see the Czech Republic with more than $797 million worth of exports. Now, in terms of year-on-year export variability, both in relative and absolute terms, except Germany and Slovakia, who both experienced contractions, for the rest of the trading partners, we have increased values ranging from 1.6 or 1.7% to 6.1%, as in the case with the Netherlands. And as for the major drivers, we have here subchapter 3925, so builders' wear of plastics for France, and subchapter 3926, driving most of Poland's exports towards Ukraine. And with this being said, let's move on to the import flow, and I will start with chapter 85. And we see that overall the year-on-year imports were up 22%, with major trading partners like China, Germany, and the Netherlands, who had strong positive changes, and we see countries like Italy and France having their exports towards Poland decrease with 1% and 9.5% respectively. In terms of major import drivers, both for Vietnam and Slovakia, the major import driver was subchapter 8517, so basically telephone sets, and I think we're talking mostly about telephones for cellular networks. Anyways, moving on to the second best import sector, chapter 84, we see that this also had a 10% increase year on year, And in fact, except the imports from Italy, who fell roughly with 4%, with all the other trading partners, we see strong increases, especially with Germany and China, both in absolute and relative terms. Although we see also big relative changes in relation with Japan or the Czech Republic, for example, but the absolute values are not that high if we compare with top performance. In terms of major import drivers, we have automatic data processing machines, as in the case with Germany, and air or vacuum pumps, as in the case with Japan. Jumping on to chapter 87, the third most important chapter driving Poland's imports, we see that the imports fell quite a lot, almost 16% in relative terms, which is almost $4 billion in absolute terms. And if you ask me, this is quite a lot. But then again, as we saw with the same chapter for the export flow, this is totally understandable, as the demand for passenger vehicles and their parts or components was down, I think, all over the world, if you ask me. Anyways, we see that this top 10 list, at least only China experienced an 8% increase, while the rest of the trading partners experienced quite big decreases, both in absolute and relative terms. As for the major import drivers, motor vehicles was the main one for both the Czech Republic and France. Moving on to the fourth biggest import driver, we see that chapter 39 experienced almost 11% increase compared with what happened in 2019, which translates to roughly 1.3 or I don't know, $1.4 billion in absolute terms, so very, very good. In terms of trading partners, on the first place we see Germany, followed by Italy, and on the third place we have Belgium. In terms of year-on-year changes, and of course considering once again just the top 10 partners, we see lots of green, so at least with these countries the change is positive. As for the main import drivers, we have for both the Netherlands and South Korea polymers of ethylene in primary forms. And with this being said, guys, we arrive at the fifth and last import driver for Poland, which is chapter 27, so mineral fuels and oils. And we see that overall the imports fell quite a lot, almost 33%, which again is a lot if you ask me, and the list filled with red cells tells us about this big decrease. In fact, the only country from these top 10 trading partners who experienced some increased value was Sweden, with almost 12%. In terms of major import drivers, I've added here again two examples, both driven by petroleum oil for Saudi Arabia and Norway, but I am pretty sure that this is the case also with other big petroleum exporters like the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, or Nigeria, for example. So these were the imports and the exports for Poland in 2020. We saw together who were the major industries, if you want, driving both the imports and the exports. And again, we saw also who are the main trading partners. And I think that I am ready to draw a couple of conclusions. And I will begin with the first one, which relates to the importance of the European Union trade bloc, especially Germany, if you ask me, as most of Poland's imports and exports are towards and from other European Union member states, again, especially Germany. My second conclusion relates to the intra-chapter trading, at least if we consider the top 5 ones, as we have common chapters like chapter 39, 84, 85, and 87, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't know if you are aware about my rule of thumb, if you want, but when you see a lot of intra-chapter trading for the most important import and export drivers, for me at least, it means that there are a lot of competitive advantages for that country, and for sure, Poland has these competitive advantages for those particular sectors. Another conclusion, and I think it's the third one, if I'm not mistaken, and don't worry, it's the last one, relates to Poland's growing imports from China, as we can see here in the table. And in fact, comparing the figure of 2020 with the one from 2016, the value increased with almost 57% in relative terms, and more than $13 billion in absolute ones, which is staggering if you ask me. And I see this effect in my daily work, if you want, when I'm discussing with my clients from Romania, for example, about their sourcing location. And it seems that more and more are beginning to source from Poland. And I guess that extrapolating that there are a lot of small and medium importers from Romania at least who prefer to buy from Poland rather than importing directly from China and passing through lots of intermediaries. And by the way, I didn't mention this important fact. This was happening well before the skyrocketing freight rates. So basically, we're talking about pre-pandemic freight rates and times, of course. And yes, in case you didn't knew, importing from China as a small or medium business, it's a pain in the ass, pardon my French, if you're not in the right network, so to speak, or you don't have a reliable supplier and a reliable contact in China. Anyways, guys, this was all for today. I really hope that you at least slightly enjoyed this video. Don't forget to comment in the section down below if you have something else to add. And of course, I will highly appreciate if you push the like and the subscribe buttons. And as usual, until next time, keep your business safe. Thanks.